Hey, well, I want to welcome you back again to A Better World with Mitchell J. Rabin. We're still having a little bit of difficulty getting Dr. Martinez on through the radio engineering board, but we're working on it. Thanks for your patience. Appreciate it. So I'm going to just share with you a little bit of a context in which we will be speaking soon. I'll be speaking until Mario joins us. But I just want to say, Mario Martinez is world-renowned for the work that he's been doing over the course of many, at this point, a few decades, in looking at, really, you could say, scrutinizing this really precious relationship between our cultural beliefs, our understandings, and the physical body, not to mention our emotional lives. But in respect to the physical body, it plays this very interesting role of how the overall belief systems of our culture are actually constantly influencing the way and the ebb and flow, if you will, of our immune function, of our thinking, and our way of inwardly behaving physiologically as well as mentally. We are all aware of the mental aspect, you could say, of the morphogenetic field of the culture, but few of us are as deeply aware of the effect it has actually on our body. And this is an area that Dr. Martinez is really a specialist in, has been brought around the world to do this kind of study and help to peel back the layers of understanding of why some people are getting healthier, other people are getting sick, and in particular, he's done a tremendous amount of work in the area of Centenarianism. So let's see. We just had him and he just disappeared. He's coming back shortly. So, and it's so interesting the work that Mario Martinez has done with Centenarians, because they have their own set of unique belief systems, you could say, and they operate according to another drummer, you could say. They dance to another drummer, not the conformist social or even cultural norms. They've stepped out of those. And we're trying to get this organized, so thank you for bearing with us. But we will be expanding upon this. Excellent. It looks like Mario Martinez, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well. I can hear you wonderful. Welcome to the show. Welcome to A Better World.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for bearing with us, everyone, as we put together the technical part of what we're doing here. Now we can dive into the other technical part, which has to do with your coding the mind and body relationship, which you've done, I want to just say from the beginning, so brilliantly. You're really a wonderful instructor and teacher of mind through the work that you've been doing for these decades, Mario. It's really impressive. You've managed to step out of the ordinary stream of thinking with, of course, I know your mentor, Dr. George Solomon, and you've really been part of forging a new way of thinking about the relationship of culture to physical health or physical illness. So just to start with, thank you. Gracias, as we say.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I remember George told me that breaking paradigms, you pay a price, and I'm certainly paying it.
Yes. But you will be paid with a higher currency as time goes on. Because,
I agree. It's well worth it.
Yes, it is well worth it. We really actually couldn't do anything else but be authentic the way we both are, because we'd be paying a dearer price for it. And in fact, I would say that mainstream thinking, slow as it is to act, is beginning to get the idea. I know I see this with my own clients and my students. They're really, really catching on to the truth behind how cellular activity is shifted through thinking, and as you go the next step to cultural belief systems. So, could you expand upon this? I gave an overview, but I'd love to hear you go into lay out basically the platform of your book and the work that you've been doing for some time now.
Okay, well, what reductionist science does is it'll come up with reductionist premises, and it'll say, how can a thought affect the cell? Are you going to talk to a cell? No, it doesn't work that way. And they stop there. But if you go deeper and you begin to look at how we learn, that our brain and our perception is cultural, and I'll explain that in a minute, but how we learn, before we have a language, we're learning. There's information constantly coming in. And you have body information when you're hungry, a newborn, and they don't know the word for hunger, they don't know the word for mother, but they see a symbol of a bottle or a breast. They make the association. There's psychoneuroimmunology that's going on when they make the association. Later, they give it a word and they say mother, bottle, but that's already been embodied and encoded into what I call a bioinformational field. When you look at that, then you can begin to see that our immune system, our nervous system, and our endocrine system are biosymbolic. For example, and here's the cultural component and the psychoneuroimmunological component. If you shame someone, let's say in the West, you shame anybody, and they will have inflammation. They will have molecules that cause inflammation, like interleukin-1 and tumor necrosis factors. These are molecules that cause inflammation, as if you had been wounded. Now, in the West, you would have that inflammation if you shame the person, because in the West we're very individualistic. In East, somewhere in Asia, you would only be having the inflammation if you believe that you have shamed the group rather than you. So there's a cultural component and there's a psychoneuroimmunological component. Totally culturally learned.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, in other words, both the cultural beliefs, i.e. the context of what appears to be a physical stress signal or illness, is as important, or it's actually a defining characteristic of what it is we've referred to as illness, or actually even more so disease. You make an interesting distinction, actually, which I'd like you to make for our audience, between what we refer to as illness and what we refer to as disease.
Well, yes, and that's where you take the anthropology and the medicine together. For example, if you have a symptom that in the West would be considered anemia, then you look for the attribution. Attribution is extremely important in all of biocognition. Then you would say, well, there's possibly some loss of red blood cells, and we will treat it based on that. B12 or anything that needs to be done. You look for possible hemorrhaging and so forth. You treat it that way, and the person gets better. But if you have the same symptoms in the jungles of Bolivia, the shaman, who's the culture editor, who's the equivalent to the doctor, will call it limpu. And limpu is a terminal illness.
That he's the authority in the context.
Yes, he's the culture editor, the authority in the context. And that person will consider limpu a terminal illness because the ideology, the interpretation, the attribution is that a spirit of a child that died early will inhabit your body in order to stay on Earth, and it will consume your body and go to another body. If you're a Western, white, or mestizo, you could be cured by the conventional treatment for anemia. Because the mestizos, which are the whites and the Indians mixture, they associate themselves with the white. If you're an Indian, no amount of Western intervention will save you. You will have a terminal illness and you'll die. But even more interesting than that, there was an agrarian reform in the 1950s in Bolivia, and the Indians were given, or the natives were given, a tremendous amount of land. There was an agrarian reform, they got land. So they went up the scale, and they were whites, then Indians, and then mestizos. Since the mestizos lost the association with the power of the white, When they began to have what appeared to be anemia before, it became limpo, and they would die just like the natives. So you see socioeconomics, culture, and disease.
Fascinating. So here we have a socioeconomic defining criterion that affects physical health as well. When people perceive themselves to be financially and socially better off and on the upper side of the ladder, they tend to be more physically robust and able to deal with offsets, if you will, more fluidly. And as they descend on that ladder, less so.
Yes, and what also interacts is the bonding of the family. You could have a very wealthy family that doesn't have bonding and a very poor family that has bonding, and the one that has bonding, independent of socioeconomics, would be healthier. So it's an interaction of the two factors.
Yes, exactly. So again, what we're looking at is what my old teacher of neurolinguistic programming, Mario, Richard Bandler, one of its founders, used to say, is look at the primacy of the subjective, because our subjective belief systems, our perception, and the valuation we give things internally are going to be those defining factors in our health, our happiness, and our well-being, that we really end up to be the authors of the whole game, if you will.
Exactly. I think what that's a really good point, and I'll expand on that. The brain interprets time and space not in what's going on out there, but the interpretation that we make of time and space. For example, it's more important to believe that you're loved than to be loved. As you can see in the people that have all these adorations and people that love them, rock stars and so forth, and they get self-destructive and they commit suicide because it doesn't matter what's coming out from the outside. What matters is the interpretation that you give of what's coming from the outside. Another example, stress is an interpretation, a contextual interpretation. Let's say that you and I are talking now, and let's say I'm at the studio, and we are talking, and the context is that we're having an interview talking about mind-body. Then a tiger goes in, and what happens? A stressful reaction. We have cortisol, we have adrenaline, noradrenaline, the immune system stops, and you have a stressor. But what happens if we're having a conversation about taming tigers? The tiger comes in, the interpretation, oh, here's a tiger we can tame. Totally contextual interpretation rather than something that's a monolith, a stressor.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good example. And you're also implying in what you're saying here, Mario, is another distinction that is oftentimes lost, which is that it's our mind, and it goes right along parallel with what you're saying. The brain does not distinguish between what we call real, what we call imaginative, or let's even say unreal, or even what's virtual. It's experiencing it in the moment, in the present, as real, and will have all of the reactions as real. Which is why, by the way, movies are so powerful a medium, because it's as though we are in the movie itself. Our nervous system is experiencing it as real, even though we know we could be watching The Wizard of Oz or Peter Pan.
Yes, and that's, I'll give you an example of how powerful that is. Some work was done by David McClellan, a psychologist, and he looked at, there's something called IgAs. These are antibodies that fight upper respiratory virus. IgAs are part of the immune system. It's an antibody created by the B cells. And he measured the IgAs in the saliva. It's in the saliva and in the blood. And he measured the IgAs before and after, showing a 15-minute video of Mother Teresa doing compassionate things, and another group, a 15-minute video of the Nazi army doing the atrocities. He measured both groups afterwards, and as you can predict, the people that were watching Mother Teresa, the IgAs went up and significantly higher. And later, other studies also show that the T cells went up, and NK cells, and anything that you can think of in the immune system goes up. Watching the Nazi army, the IgAs went down significantly, which means that you're more prone to catching a cold. But even more interesting than that, McClellan couldn't figure out why some people who were in the positive group, why their IGAs dropped so quickly. So he did another study, and he looked at he added one component, which is projecting, letting people project what's going on. And he simply showed them a picture of a man and a woman sitting on a bench, on a park bench, talking to each other, very innocuous. So you could project your own feelings or your own perception. Mm-hmm. And then he asked them to write a little story. And he said, what's going on with these two people? Some people would say, oh, he just that he got a new job and he got a promotion. She told them that she's pregnant, they're going to have a child. The other group, he just told her that he fell in love with someone else and he's going to leave her. She just told him that she was diagnosed with cancer. Those were the people who dropped. The reason is that the immune system will respond not to immediate things, but to the baseline that we have of the operative consciousness that we live.
Yes. Very interesting. That last part of the study was sort of like a living Rorschach, you know.
Yes.
They could project whatever it is where they came from. In other words, we see as we are, as they say, not as it is.
And we impose ourselves into the world, and that's our perception.
Exactly. So, therefore, what you're also positing here is that there is a physiology, if you will, and an immune function related to compassion. And by extension, we would say there is a physiology of hope. There's a physiology of feeling of self-esteem and confidence. There's a physiology to laughter and love. Could you expand on that?
Yes, I think, for example, I think metaphors and narratives are really. Learn this from anthropology. You can say something with a narrative, and you've talked about 300 pages in a book. For example, you can create a world based on your belief systems. So let's say that your belief system is one that the world is dangerous, that you can't trust people, that you have to be very careful because they're out there to get you. That mindset, what it does is it creates. You're saying that to your psychoneuroimmunology. You're saying that to your body, and so the body says, okay, if this is what's going on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep you on hyper alarm adrenaline. I'm going to increase cortisol chronically, which causes immune deficiency. The chronic adrenaline will cause the pain receptors to activate. So right there, you've taught yourself all kinds of problems: inflammation, chronic pain, and under immunity, which makes you then open the propensity to whatever illness you have in the family, because illnesses are propensities, not genetic sentencing.
Beautiful. Actually, you're outlining another interesting distinction that I learned from your book, The Mind-Body Code. In fact, I want to let everybody know that I mentioned it before you got on the air, Mario, you just attained another level at Amazon.com. Tell us, what happened today?
Well, the book is #1 now in the medicine and psychology category, which I'm very pleased and humbled by it.
Beautiful. Well, mazel tov, as we say in Chinese. That's
thank you.
Excellent news. Absolutely. The Mind-Body Code: How to Change the Beliefs That Limit Your Health, Longevity, and Success. And it's published by Sounds True, who's been just delightful to deal with in arranging this interview and all of that. It's really been a pleasure. And this is great news, because this means that even though people like you and I have been salmon swimming upstream, I'm not saying we're becoming sharks, but maybe we're becoming more popular dolphins at this point.
Yes, it's very encouraging to see that. And the book, one thing that I liked about Sounds True, I had an excellent editor, and they allowed me to not dumb it down. I didn't want to write it academically and esoteric, but I all throughout the book I tell the reader, I trust your intellect, come with me, and move through the chapters and the exercises that I teach, and it really worked. You have to respect your public. You can't just dumb it down or make it completely incoherent with esoteric terms.
That's right. That's right. And it is a really intelligent and engaging book that I don't feel is dumbed down at all. And it's a nice mixture. I mean, one of the things that I keep seeing in my work in neuropsychology, I'm not a researcher like you as such, but more of a student, and I integrate it into my work as a holistic psychotherapist, is that there's a lot of storytelling that goes on because we are dealing with the primacy of the subjective. We're not looking at an objective science the way that Western medicine posits itself, but clearly is not, and doesn't recognize the importance, except for in the field of psychoneuroimmunology, of subjective experience and subjective perception. Only now is that beginning to make any kind of dent with, and it's through the portal, I would say, of stress and stress management and recognizing the role stress has in the formation of disease. So they feel there's a little mental emotional leverage being that's showing up, you could say, in the clinical setting, unlike in the past. But one of the distinctions you make is something I really appreciated, which is that we're not only talking about the release of cortisol, but as a stress hormone, the fear, flight, freeze kind of reaction, but we're also looking at, you made it clear, inflammatory agents that will get released into the bloodstream, into the tissue, when other levels of, let's say, how would you describe it? When would those get activated?
Well, I think what's happened with conventional science is that it treats stress more than it needs to, and it interprets mind-body through stress. And it's not just stress; it's the pro-inflammatory products that you were talking about. I'll give you an example. There were some studies that looked at measuring inflammation and measuring cortisol. Cortisol would be considered stress-related, and inflammation would be considered something more than just stress. And some people were asked to write about things in their lives that they felt ashamed of, and people were asked to write in things that they felt guilty about. The people that felt guilty had a higher level of cortisol, which would be considered stress. The people who were writing about shame had a higher level of inflammation. So if you just look at stress measuring cortisol, you're going to miss the most important part, which is the inflammation that has to do with anything from cardiovascular problems to arthritis and all kinds of things. So why is that? The reason, the way I interpret it, is that you are owning up. For example, when you're guilty, you're owning up of something that you did. So you have more power. You're more empowered in the sense that this is something that I did. When you're shamed, this is something that someone is doing to you that you don't have control, so you're more disempowered. And when you're more disempowered, you're going to have a different reaction. You're going to have probably more pro-inflammatory kind of products. So if you look at stress alone, you're going to miss all the inflammatory things that are going on that could probably be even worse than stress.
Yes, exactly. That's a very, very important point, because we often say stress chemicals, and it remains rather generic. But this brings it down to a level of specificity that I think is really, really valuable. You are listening to A Better World with Mitchell J. Rabin. We are on every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have a newsletter, A Better World newsletter, that we send out to lots of people across the country and actually the world. It's for free, and it's on our website, abetterworld.tv. It announces our weekly shows. There are 3 of them. A Better World TV every Monday evening in New York City. A Better World on, Progressive Film Hour, I should say, on Gary Knoll's Progressive Radio Network every Tuesday afternoon, and then A Better World Radio and Blog Talk Radio. So we love that you come and join us and listen to us as well in archive, and forward this to your friends and family and colleagues so they too can get this level of nourishment, because so many people we're told benefit from it. We're spending today's full show with Dr. Mario Martinez, who is the author of The Mind-Body Code, how to change the beliefs that limit your health, longevity, and success. Let's go, Mario, into some of your wonderful work with Centenarians. This is something that's also distinguished you in the field because you've really borne down on understanding the psyche of those who are over 100 years old and how they got there and what do they do that's different than everybody else. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you've discovered with them?
Yeah, that's very exciting work. By the way, the Centenarians are the fastest growing segment of the population in the United States. What I did, so that's good news. What I did is I studied the healthy centenarians, only healthy centenarians, because a lot of people are afraid of growing older because of the connotation that they have that growing older is a deteriorating process. So I wanted to know what it was like to grow older healthy. And what I found things that I was not expecting. Number one, it's not genetics. Genetics is only 20%. The rest is the bioinformational field that you live and the cultural beliefs that you have. Also, these people are not, they're not in that gerontocracy mindset that, because you're older, you have to be respected, or because you're older, you should be promoted. In fact, most centenarians act like 17 and 18-year-old people. They don't live. They're very funny. They don't live to be old. The way they live is what makes them old. I asked a centenarian, what's middle age? And he said, that's a dumb question. You don't know till you die. There's no such thing as middle age. And that's true.
That sounds like a George Burns joke.
Exactly, yes. And another one, which I've heard other people say it too, so apparently it's very, very common because one of them said it to me. I asked him, and I'm not advocating this, I'm anthropologically reporting it. I'm just reporting what I saw. I asked him, when was the last time you went to a doctor? And he said, about 50 years ago. I said, well, why? Well, because I had a problem. I don't have any problems. I don't go to the doctor. So I asked him with a Western mind, so what do your doctors have to say? And he said, I don't know. They're all dead.
I love that.
And I've heard other people say that, so apparently it's pretty common with centenarians to do that.
Right. The patient far outlives the doctor. You know?
Yeah.
So why should I go to him? You know?
But I think the other thing that I found too is that they have, of course, a sense of humor, but they know how to forgive. That's a very important component. Not forgiving is one of the most toxic things you can do. And by forgiving, I don't mean an intellectual process. In fact, it's so important that I dedicate a whole chapter on forgiving. It's not intellectually saying, well, I forgive you because I'm a good person or because nobody's perfect. That doesn't work. It's a mind-body process that needs to be done. It's complex, but with the right tools, you can do it fairly quickly.
Will you go into that a little bit here? I would very much. I think that forgiveness is such an enormous part of our idealized culture, but so little part of our actual culture. It's an idea, you could say, that's hanging out in the ethers all the time. We should forgive in a phrase like that, but how to forgive, you could almost say the nuts and bolts of it, is something I don't think a lot of people have their arms around.
No, it's very, very different.
I'd love for you to really give. That would be an amazing gift to our audience.
Okay, think about it this way. Make a little picture where you can see yourself as a circle. That's you. That's your bioinformational field. Then look at another circle, and that circle is your interpretation of the world. Your interpretation of the world. When a predator hurts you, when a person hurts you, that they do something to you that you're resentful and you don't want to forgive, you take that person out of that world and you put it into your bioinformational field. So you have interpreted that. And what we do is we try to deal with the person outside. It's not the person outside, it's the person you created inside. And forgiveness has nothing to do with the predator. It has nothing to do with reconciling. That person continues to be a bad person. The rapist continues to be a rapist. But what you do is, rather than forgive that person in the conventional sense, what you do is you re-empower yourself by looking at the things that you've done, never thinking like some psychologists will say, well, thank the predator because they taught you something. I think that's nonsense and dangerous. What you do is you begin to look at the things that you have done in your life that were honorable, that were committed, that were loyal to yourself, And I'll give you a specific example. I talk about, as you know, I talk about three wounds. I call them archetypal wounds because I see them in every culture. The three ways that you can be wounded by a culture are either shame, abandonment, or betrayal. So before you try to forgive, you have to find out what wound did that person perpetrate. Was it shame? Was it an abandonment, or was it betrayal? And once you know, then you can begin to work, because each of the wounds has a healing. So let's say that you were raped, and you consider that to be a shame, which is probably the greatest shaming that you could do. First, you have to know that shame is the wound that disempowered you. What is the wound that empowers you? Honor. Honor is the healing field for shame. Nothing to do with the perpetrator. So you begin with a technique that I teach. You go into deep relaxation, and it's complicated, but I'll give you the essence. Then you begin to look at, okay, this happened to me, and I was shamed, and you actually, not intellectually, but you actually embody it. Then what have I done in my life that was honorable, totally unrelated to the incident? And you might remember that you did something honorable when you were in the 7th grade. You took the blame for somebody else, and whatever it is that you consider to be, and then you bring that and you embody that. You embody, meaning that you experience what that honor was. What it does is honor,
re-experience it.
Re-experience it, and what I call embodying it. And by re-experiencing it, you're changing the psychoneuroimmunology of helplessness to a psychoneuroimmunology of empowerment. Then you do one more process, and that's what you do the forgiving, but unrelated to the perpetrator. The predator becomes benign indifference, as the Buddhists say. You have nothing to do with the predator, but what you're doing is you're cleaning out your own bioinformational space that you created, that you brought in the predator in. Then you can decide if you want to reconcile or not. With a rapist, you don't want to reconcile. But let's say that you had something that happened with your mother and you want to maintain that relationship, then you can reconcile, but you reconcile with benign limits. You don't go back to the times when you were being shamed, but you set your benign limits and you say, this is how I'm going to have a relationship with you. I determine how far I go with you so that I don't get burned again.
Yes. Understood. That's very, very interesting. So in a sense, to interpret what I hear you saying, the person will be, in a sense, reconditioning themselves, in a sense, remembering the moment of the wound, or reconditioning themselves with the opposite virtue related to the wound. So if it's shame, then as you say, it would be honor. You could say the flip side of it. And you're cellularly reprogramming or reconditioning those cells that had been hurt, that memory that perpetuates the hurt, the shame, with the nobler, if you will, the more virtuous aspect of honor.
Yes, and I know how you mean it, but I want to be clear that in the general sense, it's not a reconditioning. It's not replacing one with the other. It's recontextualizing the felt meaning. The meaning is very important. So it's not a behaviorist, and I know you don't mean it as a behaviorist, but
right.
So it's not misunderstood by others. It's not a behaviorist replacement of one behavior with the other. You're recontextualizing the felt meaning. And what is the felt meaning? When somebody says to you, I'm going to hit you over the head with a bat, that is a cognition. When they hit you over the head with a bat, that's the felt meaning of being hit with a bat. So that's the difference. You recontextualize it at the meaning level, at the felt meaning level. So I'm glad you brought that up because I want to make.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you. I appreciate that point. It's a good one. In a sense, you're another way we could put it is we're reframing the experience by shifting the context of the actual experience.
Yes, and the meaning changes, and the meaning is extremely important.
Exactly. The meaning is where it hinges. The whole thing hinges on the meaning. As we keep talking about, that's the effect of culture.
I'll give you an example of meaning. You can, let's say you live in a tenement, in a place that you're getting ripped off by the owner of the building, and the stairs are in bad condition, and you fall and you break your leg. You're going to have more pain. You're going to need more analgesics. You're going to need more care than if you fall, break your leg, and you break your leg saving a child from a fire. All meaning.
Exactly. Again, it's context as to understanding. Or let's say that you're in a situation where you are trying to reach somebody and you don't reach them, and you try over and over and over again, and one interpretation of that is that person doesn't want to talk with me. Or you could say that person is a very important person, and they're very busy, and they're very committed to making the world a better place, and they don't have enough time today or even this week to get back to me, and because they're so busy doing the things that they need to do. So rather than experiencing this as, let's say, rejection, it could be experienced in this whole other way.
I would take it a step further. That's the first part, which is the intellectual interpretation, which is really important. The next step is, what is it that I'm feeling? What wound am I feeling? And you'll notice that when somebody's late, for example, you might say the wound of abandonment. Well, the physiology of abandonment comes, and what is the healing field for abandonment? Commitment. Right there, you make a commitment to whatever it is. You make commitment consciousness to let the person know that next time they come late for lunch that you're going to leave, or you make some commitment, and that changes the process. So that's why I call it biocognition. It's cognition and biology in a context. But it's always good to make the intellectual interpretation first, and then take it to the next level.
Yes, I understand. So you're including the feeling, and you're also you've entered a dialogue with yourself, which is going to shift the frame. It's going to shift the energy field, or the morphogenetic field of the relationship.
The bioinformation, yes. But exactly. I'll tell you something that I'm working on now that it's really interesting that you started talking about centenarians.
Yes.
I really believe you can't stop time, you can't change time, but you can change the interpretation. Oh, for example, like if you go faster than the speed of light and you travel out, you're going to age a lot slower if you stay on Earth. But at a very, very fractional level, one of the things, there's some experiments that are being done, David Eagleman and other people, and they're looking at what happens when there's novelty and when there's routine. When there's routine, time appears to take longer. When there's novelty, time seems to go, that when it's routine, it seems to go faster, and when there's novelty, it seems to go slower. The reason is when there's novelty, you have to use your brain more. What happens, though, is that when you're in novelty, in your brain, time is passing slower, and I think that has an effect on your whole physiology, on your longevity. Why am I saying that? First, because of those experiments, and second, one of the factors that you find always in centenarians is a high level of novelty. They're constantly curious, so their time passes slower in their world, not the real time, but in their world it passes a lot slower.
Yes, it's experienced as slower. It's not.
The experience is slower.
The speed of time. It's changing the experience of time, which is where the whole game is really lived, if you will. That reminds me of an experiment, Mario, I heard of many moons ago in the book, The Psychology of Consciousness, you're probably aware of. Robert, his name just jumped out of my mind. But it was a study of Zen monks who heard the bell sound before sitting in zazen, and they hooked them up with EEG and other devices to notice the shift in their brain as they experienced the sound of the bell. And what they found is, with these advanced monks, they experienced the bell novelly, freshly, almost with what they call beginner's mind, every single time the bell rang. Instead of what we tend to do is habituate in general, habituate the sound and then dismiss it and then say we know it and we miss, you could say, the changes in resonance and the undertones and the overtones of that bell every single time in a fresh moment it sounds.
Yes, and that I think that's because, as you said, when you're in routine, you habituate and you go into mindlessness. When you're in novelty, you're in mindfulness. You don't have to go to a cave to be mindful. By finding novelty, immediately you're in mindfulness. So that's exactly what happens when you're, and they're very curious. They're like children, the centenarians. They look at something, they say, look at that bug, the way it's crossing the street, or look at the, just like they're like a child,
Right.
and
Like
that is very healthy.
Yeah, it's so healthy. It means their brain is not routinized. It's not just continuing down its standard neural pathways. It's actually making new pathways, which also, I love to say, makes people more intelligent.
It allows them to have greater emotional intelligence, and also I would like to extrapolate, and this is an extrapolation, but I think there's some research that's beginning to tap into that if you are able to have your brain experience time slower, I think that increases longevity.
Yes, that's very interesting. I wonder if that has something to do with affecting the telomeres, because if you're experiencing life, experiencing it slower, we're not saying time has dilated. If we're experiencing it as a slower moment, which means kind of a fuller moment, which also implies being more in the present, that means the telomeres are being less affected by, which are of course related to the whole idea of longevity and healthy longevity. They're being less delineated. They're being less cut off.
That's very interesting, because the telomeres, as you mentioned, they're almost like a clock that tells you how many times a cell can divide before it dies. The telomeres respond to the brain's clock, not to the external clock.
Yes. Very interesting. So that it really is, you could say, pardon the expression, wound up with the bio clock.
That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's come back a little bit to one of the points you make in the book regarding the Centenarians, which is that you learned from them, or was it from your mentor George Solomon, not to disclose one's chronological age, because one begins to think of oneself in that age, and even worse, or comparably, others begin to see you in a certain encrusted context, which has nothing to do necessarily with reality. Could you comment on that piece?
Yes. The moment you tell your age, you've been put into a portal. You'll be treated based on how long you've been around rather than what you've done. I went to a museum with George Solomon once, and we were walking in, and the lady looks at him and she says, I'll give you senior citizen rate. And he said, why? Why are you assuming that? Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. So he made her really feel uncomfortable. But what he was doing was saying, why do you have to peg me? And Centenarians are the same way. They don't think in terms, they're ageless in the sense that they're not age conscious, but they're space conscious. There's nothing great about you being around. Why should you be proud that you've been around for 80, 90 years? It's nothing. What you should be proud of is what you've done with your time, not how long you've been around. Yes,
that's beautiful. It's really the quantitative. It's not the quantitative, it's the qualitative that we want to focus on that. And again, it's you could also say that it's not what we refer to as objective reality, but the primacy, again, of subjective reality, where so much. And subjective reality can also have some yardsticks to it, which, of course, is the work you do as a neuropsychologist, which is to apply some of the beautiful measures that science does give us toward looking at subjective experience.
Yes, the individual becomes the baseline rather than a group. And one thing that I've seen centenarians do, several have done the same thing. They're talking to you and they'll say, look at that old guy, the way he's walking. And that old guy could be 30 years younger. So they don't have that sense of age to them. They don't act their age. That's another thing. You don't want to act your age because that you've pegged into something. You turn 45, and let's say that our culture says that 45 is middle age. Well, that's a marker. The day before you were 45, you're not middle aged. The day you turn into 45, you're middle aged. And then you have the admonitions of the culture editors of that portal. You'll dress nicely in a way that you like and say, well, you don't want to dress like a teenager, you're middle aged. Well, I want to go back to college. Well, you should think about retirement. You should start saving for your retirement, not going back to college. Gradually, they admonish you and they put you back into that place, and after a while, you begin to look middle aged.
Exactly. You're reminding me of a story, Mario, of a cousin of mine who I was down in Florida, and I called her up. I hadn't seen her in many years, and I had heard that she had just gotten married. Well, in her case, probably about the fourth or fifth time. And yes, it's true, she outlived her husband, and maybe a divorce or two here and there along the way, no big deal. But beautiful woman into her mid-80s, and she said, "Darling, I would love to see you, but I just got married and we're driving around in my new husband's new convertible, and we're playing teenager. I'm sorry, I don't have the time to see you."
Yes, that's exactly right, and that's another component that you reminded me of the factors that I talk about in Centenarian mindfulness. They know how to set limits. For example, I think what she did was she said, "Look, I'm doing something very important to me. I care for you, but I'm setting limits." I was going to interview one, and the first thing they say is, "How can I help you?" In general, I'm just using a generality. How can I help you? And instead of "How can I help you?" like a caretaker who will make you more important than their healthy needs, he said, "How can I help?" I said, "Well, I'd love to interview you. How about Saturday at 6:00? And he said, "No, Saturday at 6:00, I have tango lessons. I can't do it." They set limits.
Yes, exactly.
It's not like, "Okay, I'll give up my tango lesson so I can talk to you." That's caretaking. That's not healthy.
That's right. No, that's a very healthy, important point for everybody, that we tend to do that. That's a cultural nuance, if you will, that we all have there's a certain, how do I say, Judeo-Christian overhang in our society, well, in this case, culture, to be more adherent to what your definitions are, so that we feel that we ought to, the word ought or should shows up rather prevalently in our society, if not explicitly, implicitly.
And it's not good for your health. Another component that you keep reminding me of these things as you talk about it is that they don't buy into what our cultures do. Most of the cultures, they teach you pseudo-humbleness.
Yes.
Wash it in face.
I love this point.
I like your shirt. Oh, I've had this shirt for 10 years. Yes, it's pseudo-humbleness because it's not real. I mean, you're not really being humble. Centenarians are truly humble. I said to a lady, she was 101, I said, "You have beautiful eyes." And she said, "Yes, thank you, I do have beautiful eyes." It's so refreshing to hear that, rather than pseudo-humbleness. So that's another thing that they do. They acknowledge their gifts, and if you say you're beautiful, they say, "Thank you very much. Yes, I think I am." And it's not narcissistic.
Exactly. And it's really interesting that we have this self-effacing notion in our society. That's a good thing, and it's not just in our society. At least in ancient China, maybe not now so much, but there was an idea where you never wanted to show how successful you were to your neighbors, for fear that they might become jealous or envious, and that energy field would then, be projected onto you. It actually has a little bit of a healthy aspect of it, because it's a counteraction to boasting and what can come of that. But there's got to be a healthy middle ground to all of this.
There is, and the Scandinavians also have that what they call a janten logen, which means you're no better than anyone, and in fact you're worse. I think that reminds me of Ernest Hemingway had a very wonderful way to deal with that. He wasn't particularly leading with that, but I'd say you can apply it. He said something like, I'll paraphrase, he said that there's no nobleness in being superior to your fellow man. The nobleness comes when you become superior to your former self.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I really like the ring of that. I really do. You know, in this conversation, I'm thinking about a place that where Jack Benny and I share something. I tell everybody when they ask me my age, yeah, I'm 39 still. And you know, sometimes they say again, or when did you become 39?
Well, I have a good friend. When they ask him his age, he says, "My age is none of my business."
It's great. It's great. And it's just so interesting. One of the stories you tell, Mario, is about the priest who comes to give the last rites to a gentleman in the hospital, but there was a mistake. Could you share that? This really,
yes.
really puts the point on it.
Yes, that brings in the culture and the culture editors. This priest goes in. It's in a Catholic hospital, so you see the culture there. And the priest comes in, which is an authority, and he gives the patient the last rites, and the patient dies within 15 minutes. The problem is that he went to the wrong room. The patient was not scheduled to die. The patient who was scheduled to die waited 2 days until the priest came.
Excuse me, that's an interesting phrase in itself, scheduled to die. According to who's scheduled, you know.
Exactly.
Anyway, go on.
The person, the interpretation, the attribution that they gave as well. If the priest is a theological authority, says that I'm going, and the doctor who is a physiological or physiology authority says that I'm gone, well, then I'm gone. And that's what the person tells the body, and you have a parasympathetic reaction and stops your heart.
Exactly. This is the power of suggestion. This is also why hypnotherapy in good hands can be such a powerful modality, why Milton Erickson was such an amazing healer for so many, because he understood that intricate relationship between language and mind and body. And through suggestion, so many miraculous, what we would call miraculous things have happened. And in fact, that reminds me of another story that you tell in your book and your audio CD set of a gentleman who was given the placebo pill from a rare disease that he had, or a disease, I should say. And it was described as kind of a Pacman effect. Could you share with our audience that story?
Peter, and this good doctor, because he used the placebo as one of his ways to help, told the patient, look, this tumor you have, I'm going to give you medication that is so powerful you can imagine it's like a Pacman eating away at your tumor. Within 6 weeks, the tumor was gone, which is not the way it works with normal biological processes. But he happened to read in the paper that the medication that they gave him didn't have any effect as a placebo. The tumor came back. Once again, he goes, right. This really something even more, and this do it. It's even more powerful than Pacman. Went back, the tumor was gone, but for the guy, saw some television that said that medication also was not good, and it was just a placebo, and the person died.
There it is. This is the way the mind and body work together. It's always been the case. It includes culture. It also can transcend culture. You know, that's another interesting point. There's something about the language, the use of language, its effect on our brain, its effect on our emotions that can move us in one direction or another. So while it's largely cultural, and I think I would like to make the point and hear what you have to say about it. I think we'd agree and be aligned on this point that culture is not necessarily something that's out there, so to speak, occupying some kind of amorphous space in the geographical landscape, but culture first begins in one's own family. Each family is its own, you could say, unit, if you will. Not a very pleasant way of putting it, but it's like a fractal aspect of nature, of culture.
Yes, and those are the shared beliefs and culture. I mean, anthropologically, it's complicated, but basically, culture, in essence, is the who you include, who you exclude, and the language that you use to communicate, in a very general sense.
Yeah.
And so that's what you get. You can see that families, for example, they quote have illnesses, and many of them die of the illness. Why? It's not just genetics. Genetics is just a predisposition. What they do is they eat together, they're in the same environment, they think the same things. You can even see pets who begin to look like their owners because of the space that they're sharing with each other and the food that they're eating.
Exactly. I say that all the time to my clients and students. It's part of a larger field. And also our bodies and brains, of course, are plastic and meaning, fully resilient. So we're always responding to our conditions, if you will.
Very much, and the neuroplasticity you talked about, there's something very interesting. When I studied neuropsychology, and some of it is still studied that way too, is that the brain is compartmentalized. To a certain degree, it's true. But for example, the occipital visual cortex, it's for the visual cortex, and that's what it is. It's specialized in that. But it's been shown now that if you block that, and Pasquale Leone has done that, teachers that were trained to work with students that are blind, what they did is they blinded the teachers for 3 weeks, and they did MRIs, functional MRIs, to see how the cortex, the visual cortex was functioning. And before they blinded them, the visual cortex was showing that it was for visual input. After 3 weeks, the visual cortex became a tactile cortex, completely plastic.
My. Yeah. So interesting, exactly. And even with the organs of the body, Mario, we find that when the gallbladder is malfunctioning, the liver takes over some of those functions, and that goes straight across the board with all of the organs are always compensating for each other. And now, how in the world can a liver do what a spleen does, except that it can? And then that will go into a whole domain having to do with stem cells and differentiation of cells, and that, you can almost say that we're one big cell. I never quite put it that way, but in some way we are one big cell that's differentiated into different parts.
Well, yes, even the heart, for example. The heart's not a pump. The heart is an endocrine organ. It creates its own hormones. It has its own regulation, as well as taking regulations from other parts of the brain. But the heart has more connections to the brain than the brain to the heart. So the heart speaks more to the brain than the other way around. So that's why you say I have a gut feeling. The gut has neurotransmitter receptors. So it's really a bioinformational field, as you're saying, rather than just localization, all kinds of things.
Yes, exactly. In fact, I really think of that we have 3 brains. I appreciate this thought about the heart as part of the endocrine system. I would say that it's also part of the nervous system because it's largely electrical. It's obviously electrochemical, but it's largely electrical in nature. So I sort of see it as an extension of the prefrontal cortex, and it has its own, as you were saying, its own receptor sites, just like the gut. And in other words, you could almost say, Mario, that the general historic understanding of physiology is largely mistaken. It's a case of mistaken identity because it's like we have brain matter strewn throughout our bodies. Your comment?
And yes, and if you study the mechanical components of the body, it looks very deterministic and very reductionistic. It has mechanical processes like the blood flows, but if you go beyond that and you begin to see the co-authoring of the system, then you can no longer go with that model. I'll give you an example. Biology, in order to legitimize itself, it borrowed the principles of Newtonian physics, which is really good for automobiles, planets, carburetors, and things like that. It's not that great for for building things, for living things. So since it borrowed from Newtonian physics, it borrowed the concept of entropy, which is going from order to disorder. That's why you see deterioration in the brain with that model. If you use complexity, which is more in tune with living systems, with open systems, complexity goes from order to disorder. The brain becomes more complex rather than more disordered.
Yes, exactly. So what you're really moving toward a shift from just a Newtonian model to a quantum model. Then we can really begin to understand really the way the body systems interact with the mind systems.
Moving the complexity theory is very, very powerful because we're quantum at the subnuclear, but that's I think that if you use complexity and chaos theory, for example, the heart is chaotic. In between beats, it has a chaotic rhythm, and the less chaotic, the more of the pathology of the heart. Well, that cannot be explained with a determinist model because it's linear. If you go nonlinear with the complexity, you find that the reason that it has that variability, that chaotic variability, is so it can allow flexibility and an input from many, many different sources that homeostasis could not allow. Homeostasis is also a very deterministic system, and it's a constant variation with complexity rather than just linear processes.
Right, exactly. That's a very interesting new way, refreshing way, a novel way, to really think about the body-mind as a system. And it's not linear at all. And even homeostasis ain't, just like Yogi Berra said, the future ain't what it used to be, So,
exactly. I do a workshop. It's not. Homeostasis is still very mechanical. I do a workshop called How to Navigate Uncertainty with Chaos as Your Guide. And that actually tunes into...
I love it. That's great. I can't let you go just yet if you have because we got a late start. Do you have a few more minutes?
Sure. Yes, of course. And thank you, by the way. You're making it very easy for me to talk about my work.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. That's my job. I'm doing my job. Excellent.
You're doing it well.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to speak with someone with your experience and level of creativity. It's so much fun. There's so many people in our field, and mine being primarily psychotherapy and stress management, that it tends to ebb toward its lowest common denominator instead of splash and act like an exciting vibration, which it really is.
Yes.
I've spent a fair amount of time studying something called the German New Medicine, but especially an offshoot of that I actually brought to the United States from France and Montreal, called total biology. Is that something that you've come across in your comings and goings? Total biology.
Is that from Dr. Hammer, or is that something?
Well, Dr. Hammer, in a sense, it's a derivative. Dr. Hammer was the teacher of Dr. Claude Sabat, who was a Moroccan-born Jewish physician, MD, PhD. One of his parents was I think, an Eastern Orthodox priest, and his mother was Jewish. And so I often say, if you really want to be successful in life, you have to be schizophrenic. And so that's another conversation.
Multicultural, that's right, yes.
No, right.
Well, there's something very similar, functional medicine. It has some similarities in that it looks at the total person, it looks at the environment, and it looks at what you can do from the outside to replicate what drugs do. Not just homeopathic, but more like what can you do mind-body, what can you do with behaviors, what can you do with environments, and it really looks at the total person. It looks at the individual as the universe in the sense of you being the baseline, as opposed to averages. Because unfortunately, health sciences is not. It assumes that it's very exact, but it's not. It's based on average statistics, analysis of variance, analysis of covariance, and there's no such thing as an average person, but you become an average and you're treated as if you were an individual from the average. So if you have an illness, for example, and you look at the normal curve and the average lifespan or the course of that illness and the prognosis and diagnosis and so forth, says that you're going to have 6 months to live. Well, that's an average. On the two sides of the curve, on the left side, on the left tail of the curve, there are people that live 6 weeks. But if you go to the outliers on the right side of the curve, there may be people that may live 10 years. So what should a responsible professional do? You should say, okay, this is an average of 6 months, and there are people on the left side that live 6 weeks, but we want to look at the outliers, people who have the same illness that you have, who live 10 years. Why don't we study them together, I as a physician and you as my patient, and see what these people are doing so we can both learn what we can do to overcome that concept of averages and go to be an outlier. That's ethical, and that's being a scientist rather than a technician.
Yes, I understand. That's a very good distinction. I mean, what client or patient has ever walked into your office and said, "Hi, Dr. Martinez, I am a statistic."
Right. There was one centenarian who went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "I have some really bad news for you, because you have a very rare illness that only 2% make it." And he said, "Well, thank you. I'm one of those 2%.
There you go. Exactly. That's
and they believe it.
Thinking. That is it right there. Quintessential. You know, now you're reminding me of something, and that is one of the tenets of total biology is that emotional stress and conflict in particular, body as metaphor, I often describe it as Louise Hay on steroids, will be the thing that unravels the physiological stress and disease. Therefore, as I know you cite in your book, in Total Biology, we will talk about someone saying, I cannot digest that. I cannot digest what this person has done. And in fact, that would lead to a stress because the brain is registering those comments as real, because in some level they are, and will begin to send gastric juices or other kinds of enzymatic activity in order to heal and solve the problem, because ultimately the brain is a problem solver and seeks to create a level of balance inside the physiology, you know?
Yes, and that's the biosymbolic question that you're asking to the brain. The brain will give it to you.
Symbolism, yes.
Why is it that women that have been sexually abused have significant level of problems with their reproductive organs? It's very similar.
Yes, exactly. And it goes on and on and on like that. But the thing that total biology also talks a lot about, and so does Dr. Hammer in the German New Medicine, as it's called, is who, by the way, as a rigorous scientist, worked with interviewing thousands of patients and found that there was a significant emotional trauma approximately 3 months prior to the onset or the diagnosis of, he worked primarily with prostate, testicular, and ovarian and lung cancers. And he found over and over again there was always, not sometimes, some form of emotional trauma that could be cited prior to the onset of the disease. He was able to use CAT scans, PET scans, what have you, to determine where in the brain the trauma was, and based on the nature of the trauma, predict what kind of cancer would be forthcoming. And he used emotional therapy, basically, as a way of resolving the problem without having to utilize conventional medical means. He actually got into a lot of trouble with that. Dr. Sabah went another step and said, it's not just about cancer, about any disease. Anything can be understood metaphorically as a conflict, of an emotional conflict, usually in the family, and sometimes always cultural, just to reinforce your point, and often generational. So, but he always talked about the conflict of the diagnosis, and said, and this is also so much in accordance with your centenarian research, Mario, the patient goes in and sits down with the doctor, and the doctor says to the patient, Mr. Jones, I don't like what I see. And the patient is a little concerned by that comment, knows what the doctor is sort of implying, and says, well, doctor, I don't like what I'm seeing either.
Yes. Well, I think
that patient is the patient that has the higher, better prognosis than the one who says, yes, doctor, I understand.
Yes, that external control is not as good as internal control. But, I'm taking psychoneuroimmunology to the next level, which is cultural psychoneuroimmunology. Psychoneuroimmunology has studied as if culture doesn't exist and too much rat studies. Rats are good to study, but you have to remember that they don't have a sense of their longevity and their mortality, and they don't have meaning. So what you're studying with rats is the neuroendocrinology. And immunology, not the psycho, because the psycho includes meaning and it includes mortality and so forth. But I'll give you another example. I've seen more than pretty close to 1,000 patients in many years with fibromyalgia. I have not found one that didn't have some kind of a shaming wound, which is pro-inflammatory.
Case in point. Corroborating the fundamental idea that underlying somatic disease or illness will be some emotional undercurrent.
And unfortunately, if you do a clinical history and you don't go deep, you're not going to find it. I was looking, and it's a high incidence of sexual abuse, but there was this patient that just wasn't fitting. And I kept asking if any abuse and kept going on and even doing something with a deep relaxation. Couldn't find anything. But I said, okay, how did you sleep at night when you were a little girl? Well, I was never abused, but how did you sleep? I didn't sleep very well. Why? Because now that you ask me, I remember that my parents fought a lot, and I thought that if I went to sleep, they were going to kill themselves. So therefore, a hypervigilance that doesn't let you go to sleep deeply, you don't get delta sleep, you are deprived of human growth hormones. There goes fibromyalgia.
No melatonin either.
Melatonin, but mainly if you don't go into delta, you don't have in the and the thetas, you don't, especially delta, you don't have the secretion of course melatonin is deprived, but the secretion of human growth hormones, which is what allows the immune system to do the repair and rebuild protein muscles and so forth. So if you don't have that after a while, then you're going to have a problem. And I explained it more deeply in the book and other articles, but that's basically the idea that there's always some kind of shaming or hyper-alarm that doesn't allow you to go into deep sleep. Fibromyalgia, the main component, I think, is delta sleep deprivation.
Interesting. Really
and it can be cured, by the way.
Yeah. So you refer to shame, abandonment, and the third one is?
A betrayal.
I'm sorry?
Betrayal.
Betrayal, okay. And what would rejection be considered part of abandonment?
Well, it's interesting because it's very, very subjective. For example, I worked with twins, and both had been sexually abused by their uncle, and one of them saw it as shame and the other one saw it as betrayal. So you have to identify it subjectively, as you said before, what the person interprets the wound, and then you give it the healing field. For abandonment, it's a commitment. For betrayal is loyalty, and for shame is honor.
I'm glad you brought that up. As I was reading, Mario, when I read that loyalty was the healing field for betrayal, what also came to my mind was trust.
Yes, because it's really a betrayal of trust. It's a tricking.
That's my point. That's my point. It seemed to me that the more accurate counterpoint to betrayal was trust, the other side of the coin.
Yes, because loyalty has to do with trusting without evidence. It's almost like faith.
That's correct. That's correct. Exactly.
Sometimes people will say, well, what's the difference between abandonment and betrayal? You have been left, and betrayal, you have been left, possibly, And I think the difference is that abandonment is losing a commitment to something. Betrayal is losing a devotion, the trust in a devotion, the devoted love or devoted God or something that's more exalted, a higher emotion than the abandonment.
Yes. You're highlighting the subjective, interpretive aspect of it is so important, because I often say to clients and to students that abandonment could be experienced by an infant at his or her mother's breast, which, by the way, I think is the in utero experience from conception forward is something highly underplayed. And I would like to see it. In fact, I'm doing something in New York with a group of consummate professionals regarding a couple from Brazil, actually, about the in utero prenatal, perinatal experience. But it's underplayed in our understanding of, adult psychology. But that the infant could interpret the mother leaving the child for a moment in the crib, removing the infant from the breast because she had to deal with an emergency of either another child or a husband or whomever, and then comes back. The mother's intention was fully to give the proper feeding to the infant, but the infant may feel that they're being left, and they don't have any understanding of the reason. They just know they feel the fact is they were momentarily left. The subjective interpretation might be abandonment. Could you comment?
That's a great point. Yes,
yeah.
I think the way to look at it is like this: in a ontogenetic way, abandonment is most primitive. Then you have shame, and then you have betrayal. Why? Because if you leave a child, as you said, they could die. Shame, you can't shame a child till they can see themselves in the mirror and say, "This is me." You have to have an image of me, and betrayal is higher because betrayal is trust. But abandonment, as you said, the removal of the breast, and we're very resilient. I don't want to come out with people to think that I'm talking about one time. It's a pattern of abandonment.
Absolutely.
The child doesn't have a word for it, but it has a biocognition that later can give it a word and say, "Oh, so this is abandonment." There's a physiological, psychoneuroimmunological process of taking something away that you need, and if it happens in a pattern, even though you don't have the word for abandonment, you have a bioinformational field that feels like abandonment, and then later you can give it a linguistic label.
Exactly. Only later on can they give it a term with a concept connected to describe what their feeling was from way back. And your point, I think it's a good one for maybe wrapping up a bit here, which is that we are resilient, and even though we have had those patterns way back when that may have gotten even somewhat entrenched, even through abuse of different sorts, be it physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, it forms a certain level of identity. But before I kind of playfully said it's a good thing to be schizophrenic, and of course I was playing with that, literally. But in the work that I've done and the work that you're doing, I see that you talk about almost like one identity could develop the way you talk about ignoring what isn't working and building on what is working. So in a sense, you're building a new neural net around what is working in somebody and extinguishing over time. I know this sounds a little behaviorist, but there is a level on which that may be true. You're extinguishing those neural patterns that weren't serving, that were actually creating illness. Could you comment on that?
And to differentiate it from behaviorism, you definitely, if you have a thought, you're going to have a neurotransmitters for that thought. They don't go as deep as if that thought then becomes biocognition, because you have more emotion, you have more processes going on. So the more contributory factors, the stronger and the deeper the neurotransmitters are going to function, and the stronger and the deeper the neural maps are going to be developing. So this is why saying to yourself, I'm a wonderful person, I'm wonderful, doesn't work because it's only intellectual. If you embody it and you give yourself evidence, then the neural maps work a lot faster and deeper, and then you can, it's like use it or lose it kind of thing.
Exactly. It's like building a muscle with love. It's like building a muscle with passion, you know.
Yes.
You don't just do the mechanical act. You have to throw your whole being into it.
Yes. Never Pollyannish and, oh, I'm so wonderful because I was hurt. Never do that. Always embody what's going on and then deal with whatever it is that was going on.
Exactly. Be honest with yourself, in other words, and move on from there by building up the other aspects of yourself. Exactly. Your closing words to our audience. This has been so wonderful, Mario.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope that the audience got something out of this. But the most important thing is that we can't really simplify things and say, well, forget about medicine, forget about this, forget about that. It doesn't work that way. What you have to do is take the best science, rather than, that's why I don't like the word alternative medicine. I like integrative medicine, bringing the best. Biocognition doesn't replace anything. It just enhances the science, and it's based on science. But also, don't buy into the reductionist technicians. If you have a doctor that doesn't want to work with you, find another one. And find a scientist who's willing to look at an empirical question and say, okay, let's find out. Prove it to me, and I'll learn something from you. Rather than say, no, this is how it is. I know more about medicine than you do. Do it my way. Don't do that because you're a consumer, and you want people that are willing to be teachers rather than inquisition kinds of people that don't have any respect for you. So the attribution is real important. How you attribute things will have a biology. And then look for the best science and allow yourself to believe what I call that you can turn into centenarian mindfulness at any age. And that doesn't mean you're going to live 100, but it means that you're going to live a quality of life that you didn't have before if you don't allow yourself to accept that strength that you have within you that has been developed. The causes of health have been developing for the last 100,000 years for Homo sapiens. So the causes of health are stronger than the causes of illness.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't mean you'll live to 100. It'll mean you'll live to 200.
I have a good friend whose father turned 80, and we went out to dinner, and he was a little depressed, and I said, look, I'm a little concerned about you, and he said, why? I said, because I don't know what you're going to do for the next 40 years. And he just lit up, and it was just a completely different perception of, is it true? I don't know, but what it does is it empowers a person to bring out the best of what they have.
Exactly. I say to my father all the time, it's so similar. What are you going to do for the next 40, 50 years? Develop some wonderful hobbies, Dad, because, you know, he said, I'm too busy to get to die, you know.
You don't have any time for that.
To do with this life, you know. It's a very healthy perspective. Well, Dr. Mario Martinez, I want to just thank you again for the good work you're doing, excellent work you're doing. And,
my pleasure, and I congratulate you for the great work you do also.
Well, thank you so much. Your website, do you want to share your website with our audience?
Yes, it's very simple, biocognitive.com, BIOCOGNITIVE, or look up biocognition, Google biocognition, biocognitive, and you can go there.
Beautiful work. Great, Mario. Thanks again, and we'll
Thank you.
Another time.
Anytime you want. My pleasure.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
I know. Dr. Mario Martinez, The Mind-Body Code, How to Change the Beliefs That Limit Your Health, Longevity, and Success, is a book that just reached the Amazon.com best-selling book in the field of psychology and medicine today. So you could say today was a celebration. Today's show was a celebration of Dr. Mario Martinez, which he wholly deserves. Anyone who is blazing a trail, who is willing to really think out of the box and, you know, just be really creative is the kind of person that creates novelty in the world, stimulates us. The imagination, I think I have said many times, is God's great gift to us, and we need to really honor that so much. And what a pleasure for me to interview Mario. This is work that I've been looking at for a number of years now, and I integrate it into a lot of the work that I do with my own clients and students. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Our website is www.abetterworld.tv on the media side, and on the counseling, coaching, and therapy, stress management side, mitchellrabin.com. MITCHELL, that's double L, RAB as in brilliant, IN.com. So he told us not to be modest, right? That's right. You know, it's a fun thing to give acknowledgement and to be acknowledged. It's a very powerful way of increasing immune function, by the way, and just generally feeling good. The role of pleasure, while it's not the highest experience in the world, is also a very pretty high one. Let's say that joy, happiness, well-being, spiritual fulfillment are the very, the creme de la creme of human experience, of beaming optimum health, another one. But pleasure is very much a conduit to these higher virtuous emotions, these, as Mario puts it beautifully, exalted emotions. So I want to encourage you to be free with the idea of acknowledging others and acknowledging yourself as you move through your life. And it's rich. It's an act of generosity toward others and toward yourself. And everyone sort of gets aligned in the loving space that it creates. So on that note, I just want to thank you all again for listening to and becoming part of A Better World's community. We are on every Wednesday at 6 p.m. We love when you listen live and know that most listen in archive. That began to rhyme. In fact, I wanted to say as an addendum to something Mario said when he said to look for a doctor or look for a scientist to work with when it comes to this idea of growing older. We all grow older, and a marking of growing older could be to become wiser. But aging is voluntary. Aging is something else. And to distinguish between the two, I think, is actually an act of wisdom in itself. So with that said, I want to just also remind you that we sustain ourselves on donations. We always appreciate that. And to help empower all of you, A Better World is becoming a foundation, a nonprofit, which will allow us to give back to you, not just the content of our shows, but even something highly hailed in our society called a tax deduction. So please bear that in mind when you visit our website. You can always contact me. Also, I love your comments and feedback. It's always helpful to me at mjr@abetterworld.net. MJR, my initials, at abetterworld.net. Remember that we have all sorts of interesting energy balancing systems here at A Better World. You can read about those on both websites, and we offer them at discounted rates for those who are interested in dealing with the energy fields around everything that we've been talking about here. So also note that in New York on March 11th, coming up soon, at One Spirit Learning Alliance, Better World and One Spirit are partnering and collaborating in what will be an evening on pre- and perinatal psychology, i.e., conscious conception through to conscious birthing. This will be really wonderful. We'll have my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Francois Amigues, osteopath from the Ideal Community in Jaffrey, British Columbia, coming down. We will have Laura Uplinger coming up from Rio de Janeiro, Carla Machado also coming up, from Brazil, and Monica Matos from Minneapolis, who is making an extraordinary film called Life Imitates Birth. And we'll be at the One Spirit Seminary Learning Alliance on West 36th Street. Go to the website for more details. On March 11th from 7 to 9:30, there'll be a really interesting presentation, a clip of the film, and followed by a robust, dynamic discussion. It's for everybody, although we are specifically inviting midwives, doulas, OBGYNs, young parents, parents-to-be, those contemplating being parents, and anyone who is interested to come join. We'll be doing the same thing pretty much at the UN on March 12th, also open to the public, interestingly. Also, last, I want to remind you that there will be the Paradigm Shifts Film Festival, which is actually a multicultural festival, music and film, focusing on indigenous people and the environment. That will be in New York City at Baruch College, starting on March 19th for 2 consecutive weekends, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday of both. Again, just go to abetterworld.tv and all the information is there. It's really going to be good as well, and something you really want to tune into if you're anywhere in the New York area, tri-state region. Again, thanks so much for joining. Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Spent the show with Dr. Mario Martinez, the author of The Mind-Body Code. Well worth your while. Thanks to Sound True for publishing it and for the audio CD, which you can get at their website, soundstrue.com. On that note, how about a little Mozart, folks? Good night, and see you.